the order of business this evening is, of course, it's about the Hong Kong investment visa, but I'm going to basically address the issue about who does have a visa problem if you started your own business, you're in the process of starting your own business. Most people in Hong Kong that go on to get an investment visa start out as a visitor, or they have an employment visa sponsored by an employer and they're adjusting their status from sponsored employment through to business investment. But we'll just go through the various immigration stati that exist in Hong Kong to ask the question if you've actually got the type of problem that requires you to pay close attention to what I'm talking about this evening. We'll look in detail at the visitor visa because, as I mentioned, effectively the vast majority of people who go on to get a business investment visa start out with the visitor status. And there's a great deal of confusion as to what is permitted activity as a visitor and what is not permitted activity if you've got that status and you're in the throes of starting your own business. We'll look at the conditions of the investment visa, the approvability test for that visa, and you'll learn effectively what you need to do to pass that test. And I'll leave you with a message about halfway through that I hope you'll conclude for yourself, and that is that if you're going to go and apply for this visa effectively, the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that you bring to your venture, if you bring that to your application for an investment visa, then in my experience you will be successful. I always find it amazing that people grasp the nettle to become an entrepreneur in Hong Kong and put their money on the line and are ready to go for it, but then when it comes to actually doing what's required to get the permissions from the immigration department to engage in that activity, there's a certain amount of reticence and people don't want to spend money on it, and they're just a little bit concerned about the decisions that they're making and whether it's good for the business where it might not be actually great for the visa application. But as I say, the message I'm going to leave you with is this idea that if you've had your entrepreneurial seizure, you're made of the right stuff if you apply the same kind of psychology towards the immigration challenge that you've got to get the visa status that you're looking for. So we'll look in detail at the challenge and whether or not you can get the visa, and because if you get an investment visa and you're here with your loved ones, there's always the question about what kind of immigration status the people that you love and care for will be securing on the back of your application. So we'll look at that. And then I'll take you discreetly through each of the resources that I've made available to everybody, free on our website, and explain to you how you make those work in the context of your own application, so that at the end of the exercise you should be able to get it all done completely free of charge. Okay. So, the anchor to this talk is found on the homepage of HongKongVisaVisa.com. It's this post called 10 must-have resources for any Hong Kong investment visa application. And at the end of the talk, I'll take you through those resources, but bearing in mind that everything I have to say today is going to talk about the investment visa from 39,000 feet, and then as you learn more and more about it, you'll be able to discern exactly what's required down at the micro level to be successful in making an application. The Immigration Department's website's not that great, when all things considered. The Immigration Department's website is designed to basically inform you. The Immigration Department's job is to inform and decide. It's not their job to advise. So when you look at their website, it all seems very clear-cut and very easy to manipulate and seems very simple and straightforward, but when you actually understand the processes which the Immigration Department follow and the minutiae of the consideration process that gives rise to an approval or an refusal, you'll see it's actually, there's a lot going on and it's quite involved. But the Immigration Department do their job against the backdrop of immigration policy. And immigration policy flows directly from the Immigration Ordinance. And under the Immigration Ordinance, effectively the Director of Immigration is empowered to make policy and is then empowered to develop methods and systems to implement that policy. And effectively what it means is that the Director of Immigration has got all the discretion in the world from a practical perspective to approve or refuse, which is very different from other jurisdictions like Canada, the US, Australia, which is all very legalistic. So in Hong Kong, the policy is based on flexible conceptual hurdles that you need to overcome, rather than black letter law. Have you got this? Have you done that? Have you done the other? And it's very straightforward as to why the Immigration Department do this. The Immigration Department don't want to prescribe the process of implementing policy to a legislative framework, because if it's devolved into legislation, it means that it can be appealed by the courts or to the courts, and the Immigration Department don't want that. So it isn't legalistic and it isn't overly bureaucratic. I've got a great amount of respect for the Immigration Department because they do a great job. They get literally hundreds of thousands of applications across all different visa categories each year. They've only got limited resources, and in my experience they get it right the vast majority of the time. They're not infallible, they do make mistakes, but in the main the Immigration Department do a pretty good job given the way that policy is configured and implemented. And so effectively, while they're doing the job in the context of investment visas, they're looking for welcome investment. Now, welcome investment can take the form of direct investment into a business that's going to create local jobs, and it's going to add interesting technology to society, it's going to do interesting things generally stated. But welcome investment can also be in the guise of a social enterprise as well. And again, this whole idea of welcome investment sits within the essential remit of the Immigration Department as to having the discretion as to how policy should be configured. But effectively, when you're looking at an investment visa scenario, the Immigration Department are keen to see that there is both the promotion of new local job opportunities and the maintenance of jobs for locals. Again, this concept of welcome investment, as I've just explained, but also because the Immigration Department are part of the Security Bureau, clearly there's a security dimension to the way that they do their work as well. And it might be that you can, in a sense, tick all the boxes to get an investment visa approved, but you then get refused on a security objection. That's the bad news. The thing about security objections is if it raises its head, you're never going to know. And invariably, in my experience, security objections don't fall to the characters of the individuals per se. Usually, security objections fall to the nature of the business that you're wanting to get involved in. And an example of this in the past has been a case which was, for all practical purposes, a pyramid scheme. But there was a very top Queen's Counsel opinion as to the nature of that scheme, and the Queen's Counsel said no, it's not, in his opinion, a pyramid scheme. But the Immigration Department, when they looked at it, because they couldn't satisfy themselves definitively that whether it was or whether it wasn't a pyramid scheme, they erred on the side of caution and decided not to give the visa in that instance because they felt that there were security issues associated with the nebulous nature of the legal status of that venture. Whilst the vast majority of people who make applications for investment visas are foreign nationals, not mainland residents of China, if you are a mainland resident of China and you want to come to Hong Kong and engage in this type of activity leading to the grant of a business investment visa, you do have an extra hurdle to jump, but I'll talk about that when we get to that point in the presentation. Right, so at this point, I ask you all to stand up if you would, please. Right, okay. You don't have to stand up if you don't wish. Right, I would like you to sit down if you have a permanent identity card. Okay, I would like you to sit down if you've got the right to land. I'd like you to sit down if you've got unconditional stay. Please sit down if you have a dependent visa. Please sit down if you've got 10 million Hong Kong dollars invested into qualifying investment asset classes and you are in possession of a capital investment entrance scheme visa. Please sit down if you have won a Nobel Prize or you've represented your country in the Olympics or you're a concert virtuoso and you have a quality migrant admission scheme visa. Right, okay, so everyone that remains standing needs to pay really close attention to what I'm saying tonight because you have a visa problem if you intend to establish or join in a business. Please sit down. Let's get the issue of mainlanders out of the way first. In Hong Kong, we have something called the floodgates policy. We're only 7.2 million people in this town. There's only 6 million people when I moved here 27 years ago. So population is growing considerably. Now, of those 7.2 million, there are, as you know, 1.2 billion north of the boundary, a large amount of whom, if you will, would like to come to Hong Kong. Now, clearly, we can't accommodate large numbers of mainlanders taking up residence here. So if you're a mainlander and you want to participate in the program to get a business investment visa, you need to satisfy one of two conditions first. The first is that you need to have lived outside of China for a minimum of 12 continuous months immediately prior to making your application for a business investment visa. If you can satisfy that precondition, then you will be treated on an application just like every other foreign national would be. Alternatively, if you own PR from a third country, you can also make an application to the Immigration Department for a business investment visa. Now, when the policy for PR came into play, the expectation of the Immigration Department was that effectively, if you have lived in Canada, in the US and gotten yourself a green card, or you lived in Canada or Australia previously, sufficient to the extent that you've secured permanent residency there, then because the floodgates policy, it would be okay for you to make an application to come and live here because you've done your time overseas previously to the extent that you could acquire permanent residency there. However, some very enterprising people decided, probably a dozen years or so ago, that it may be possible to use the vestiges of some immigration programs that existed prior to the handover, when there was a great deal of fear in Hong Kong about the future, such that certain African countries put on their books the opportunity for people to literally buy permanent residency. And the favourite jurisdiction out of these was Gambia. And most mainlanders that want to come to Hong Kong come under the 10 million Hong Kong dollar program, the Capital Investment Entrance Scheme. And firstly, they go to Gambia and they get PR in the Gambia, and then that makes them, on the face of it, eligible for consideration under the Capital Investment Entrance Scheme. And the question's begged, well, if you're a mainlander and you do that under the $10 million program, can you also use Gambia under the business investment visa program? Because as you'll see, the investment required under the business investment visa is marginal compared to the 10 million Hong Kong dollars that's required under the Capital Investment Entrance Scheme. And so certain people have made applications in the past for business investment visas using Gambia as the PR mechanism for mainlanders. And what they don't realize is that the Immigration Department, because they've got the ultimate discretion, they will say, well, you're eligible to apply for a business investment visa if you're in the mainland and you've spent 150,000 Hong Kong dollars buying a PR in the Gambia. But they look at the business plans in such great detail that if you effectively put any less than 10 million Hong Kong dollars into your business, you're going to get denied. So they may as well have done the Capital Investment Entrance Scheme in the first place. But that's the pathway for mainlanders. It doesn't apply to other foreign nationals, but it's important to get that out there. Okay, so the visitor visa. What can you do if you've arrived at the airport, you've smelled the air, you can smell money, you think, right, this town is for you. What's permitted activity as a visitor? Can you actually incorporate a company? Can you take steps to recruit people? Can you enter into a commercial arrangement with WYND and all the rest of that as a visitor? Well, essentially, the visitor visa anticipates that you're going to come, engage in a genuine business visit, that is where you visit your customers, suppliers, your contacts and other parties, finish what you need to do and then leave without any expectation of thinking about residence here. If on the other hand you have secured a job offer and you've got an application in for an employment visa working for somebody else, you can arrive as a visitor prior to the grant of your employment visa, and you can engage in pre-relocation for business residence activities. So this is orienting yourself to Hong Kong. You can do things like get your mobile phone organized. You can enter into a tenancy agreement for somewhere to live. You can do all the things preparatory to the starting of your work, but not actually doing that work. If you come as a visitor, you can participate in trade fairs, you can speak at conferences, as long as you don't get paid for speaking at a conference. And at the trade fair, whilst you can show your wares and represent your company's interests, you can't effectively open a till and sell things across the counter at a trade fair. In the context of starting a business, effectively what you're left with is you can engage in activities preparatory to the commencement of your business, but if your intention to reside has crystallized, then you should be thinking about making an application for a business investment visa. And in a sense, in a hard delineating fashion to try and sort of put a line between what's permitted and what's not permitted, effectively, if you've established a company and you are trading, that is, you've issued your first invoice, then you've effectively joined in a business. And joining in a business isn't permitted activity as a visitor. But ultimately, it's delineated by the attitude of the Immigration Department to prosecute for breach of conditions of stay if they discover that you have engaged in activity not commensurate with your visitor visa status. This falls into what I've called the catch-22 for the vast majority of people who are here as visitors, that are clearly committed to a venture, that they've put money into a deal, they've put together all the infrastructure arrangements to support the business transactions that you're anticipating to run through your enterprise. This catch-22 situation I'll discuss, but it's driven by this notion that if you have an application for a business investment visa in the system and you're here as a visitor and you've effectively started trading, normally the Immigration Department don't penalise you. They forbear to prosecute for breach of conditions of stay. It's if you've engaged in business activity as a visitor and you haven't put an application into the system that the Immigration Department don't like that, because that's clearly a breach of your conditions of stay as a visitor. But I'll talk about that in some detail when we get to the relevant slide in the presentation. So that's the visitor visa. Now I want to talk just briefly about the employment visa predicated on a job offer. That is, a job offer that's extended to you as a foreign national from an independent third-party arm's-length employer that anticipates that you're not invested in the business, you don't have any value at risk in the business, you possess special skills, knowledge and experience of value to and not readily available in Hong Kong. And in the context of the job offer that's been extended to you, the employer believes they're justified in engaging your services as an expatriate rather than the services of a local person because of the overall makeup of the work that you've been brought on board to do. Now, the reason why I've explained the investment visa provability test to that level of detail is because for 20 odd years people have been saying to me, well, hang on a minute, I know what I'll do. I'll incorporate a company and I'll have that company give me a job offer. And in the context of that job offer, I'll sponsor myself and I'll show to the Immigration Department that I possess special skills, knowledge and experience of value to and not readily available in Hong Kong. And they'll give me a visa to work for my own business. Now, actually, functionally, if you get an investment visa, as you'll discover, that's in fact is kind of what happens. But it's not the process that the Immigration Department follow to determine whether or not you're going to get the approval that you're seeking if you actually own the company that you work for. Because it boils down to sponsorship. If you work for a third-party arm's-length employer, that third-party arm's-length employer needs to be deemed a suitable and credible sponsor. And that employer, in the context of the job offer that is extended to you, needs to sponsor the application. Whereas if you have an application for a business investment visa, even though the end result is that the Immigration Department allow you an employment visa to work in the company that you own, the approvability test that the Immigration Department apply to your application for an investment visa is considerably different. Because in this scenario, the Immigration Department are looking to you as an individual and your own special skill set and your CV and the value that you add to Hong Kong's economy in the context of that job, and the fact that nobody else in Hong Kong could objectively assess, be able to actually do that. If you're making an application for an investment visa, the approvability test is you need to show that you can make a substantial contribution to the economy of Hong Kong. And in this regard, the Immigration Department are looking to the business. They're not looking to you. You per se are a mere resource to the business, and there are other resources that I'll discuss in a moment. But effectively, the business investment visa approvability test requires a searching analysis of how fundamentally your business is going to benefit Hong Kong and ultimately go on to become, whilst a startup, a solidly entrenched commercial enterprise. So the difference between the two is that the focus on the investment visa is on you, on your business and the money that you're putting into the business and how Hong Kong is going to be tangibly benefited as a result of your investment activities. Whereas for an employment visa, it's an arm's length third party employment where the focus is on your CV. Okay. Substantial contribution to the economy of Hong Kong. That's like asking how long is a piece of string. But there are certain sort of themes that present themselves in every approved investment visa. And these themes are what I call the 3 pillars of approval. On the one hand, your business needs to have a clear pathway to the creation of local jobs. So if your business is a one-man business, forget it. You're not going to get approved. Because the test is substantial contribution to the economy of Hong Kong, not substantial contribution to the economy of the individual applicant. So, very important, clear pathway to the creation of local jobs. Secondly, the Immigration Department expect to see that you're going to have suitable business premises, or as they couch it, a properly set up office. Because after all, if you're going to have local employees working for you, then they clearly have to have somewhere to report to work to each day. They can't come to report to work to your spare bedroom or your kitchen table. They've got to have a place that they can show up for work each day. And the third leg of the approvability stool is you have to show that you've got resources that are going to be deployed into the business to the benefit of the business. Now, resources here are really split into 2 types. There's funding resources on the one hand, and then other resources. Now, these other resources are typically, in my experience, all the things that you normally have present in your venture that are driving you to make this investment decision in Hong Kong in the first place. It's the good stuff that says, yeah, I think I can be successful because I've got this going for me, I've got that going for me, I know that person, I've got these things all weighing positively in my favour. And it will depend on your business as to what those resources are. But just, as a few examples, you could have a minimal viable product that you've already established, that you've already coded for, and that you're now ready to commercialise. It could be that you've got some intellectual property that you've been able to license that you're bringing to Hong Kong that's proven to be successful somewhere else previously. And if you bring it to Hong Kong and deploy your other resources along with this IP, then there's a really good chance that you'll be successful and your enterprise, as I say, will go on to become a solidly entrenched commercial enterprise. It could be work in progress. It could be a confirmed contract. It could be really anything, as I say, that exists that allows you to believe that you can be successful and it's driving you to make the investment decision. So these are the 3 pillars of approval. Now, half a year ago, I used to counsel clients to the extent that, yeah, well, if you've got a business plan, that's great, and you've got the money that you need, that's great. What you kind of can get away with is you go to the Immigration Department with your story, and if you tell the Immigration Department that over the course of the first 12 months you'll achieve these particular outcomes, addressing each of the 3 legs of the approvability stool, then the Immigration Department will buy into that. Which was good advice until about 10 or 12 weeks ago, when I had 3 denials all on the same day. And I was confounded by this. But the one thing that they had in common was that they were all planning to effectively implement their business plan over the course of 12 months. And the immigration department told me that was no longer sufficient, that they needed to have their, rather than have their money in the bank account at the point of approval, expecting that a lot of it would have been invested 12 months hence, they want to have the investment materialize in the first 6 months. Because what I discovered was that in business investment visa holders were saying they were going to do all these key things and be really, aggressive in terms of giving effect to their plans to bring about a substantial contribution to the economy of Hong Kong. But as soon as they got approved, they went into lean mode. I've got my visa now, I don't have to worry about it. I'll just wait and then, get to 8, 9 months, 10 months and then do something about it. And a large number of these people apparently were getting to month 11 and making their applications for extension, and the immigration department would probably drag them over the coals and give them an extension. But they began to see a pattern emerging where effectively everybody was saying one thing at the point of approval, then when it came to actually doing what they were supposed to be doing, they weren't doing it. And so now the immigration department are routinely refusing applications that are looking to a 12-month investment timeline. It's now 6 months. So if your plan doesn't anticipate that you're going to create local jobs and have a properly set up office in the first 6 months, which is the normal consideration time frame for this application, then expect that you're going to get refused. So it's a 6-month timeline now. Okay? As I say, the game's changed. Okay, now this is literally the million-dollar question. How much cash do you need? Let me throw a question out there, just so that I can get a sense of the state of mind. How much do you think is a minimum amount of money that you would need to get an investment visa approved? Let me ask you, what do you think that number is? Just curious.
I don't know, is that 10 million?
How much? 10 million? You don't need 10 million, definitely not. How about you? What do you think? $500,000? Any other ideas?
It depends. It depends on the business you're starting. It needs to make sense to cost you outlay in your investment needs. Obviously you can't have 10,000 for a business. It's going to need like $1 million and vice versa. Like, why would you say you're going to bring in $1 million if your business only needs 100,000? It just needs a tie to your business plan.
Yeah, which is absolutely accurate. However, when you go into an application for an investment visa, what you really want to do is to be able to put your head on the pillow and sleep well at night, knowing that you're not going to get denied because you don't have enough money. Now, it may be that your business plan really only calls for $100,000, $150,000, but I can tell you the immigration department are not going to accept that. In my experience, if you have between $500,000 and $1 million Hong Kong dollars available to the business in real cash terms, you can tick that box normally. Unless, of course, you're going to engage in a business that requires have a much greater amount of capital, and you put forward this wonderful business plan and you haven't got anywhere close to enough capital to actually deliver on that plan, then you'll get denied on that basis. So you've got to have sufficient capital to fund the plan that you've got. But ticking the box $500,000 to $1 million is about it. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule, but when clients come to us and I say, right, how much cash have you got? And they tell me the number, I can say, right, you can tick that box. I know you're going to need to think about that. Now, the interesting thing here is that the immigration department expect to see some of that money in the company bank account, but they're also quite happy to accept that you've got other funds available to you in other bank accounts located anywhere in the world, as long as they're in your own name and they're readily accessible, that you can draw down on to help you support your business plan. Because the immigration department look at your ability to fund the business in the round. So you definitely need to have money in your company bank account, but if you don't have all of it in your company bank account and you've got a cash or cash equivalent assets elsewhere, then that will be acceptable to the immigration department as a source of funding. Yeah.
Do you know the breakdown of that? Like how much we would need within the country and how much we can have somewhere else?
Depends how much cash you need to finance yourself for the first 6 months locally, but I'd say if you've got $500,000, put 300,000 in your company bank account and have 200,000 standby ready to bring in as and when you need it. Now turn our attention to the catch-22 that I mentioned earlier. And the problem with Hong Kong immigration is that, as I say, most people arrive as visitors, or indeed if you actually have an employment visa sponsored by an employer, a prior employer, and you've left that employment, and you've still got a valid period of stay endorsed in your passport left over from your past employment. But you've decided that you're going to go into business for yourself, and you've engaged in activities that are not strictly commensurate with your condition of stay as a visitor. So what do the Immigration Department make of this? Well, when you understand how the Immigration Department's consideration processes play out for an business investment visa, you realize the Immigration Department are actually kind of like, in a sense, tacitly encouraging you to do things through their requests for information, like show us that you've employed somebody, give us a copy of your management accounts, show us a copy of your bank statements for the last 3 months for the company, where they can effectively gather, in a sense, evidence to see what's been happening on your bank account. So because the Immigration Department expect to see proof that you've created, or you're in a position to create new facts on the ground that allow them to conclude that you are in a position to make a substantial contribution to the economy of Hong Kong, you have this essential catch-22 in play. And so, because the Immigration Department don't want to throw logs at the feet of entrepreneurs, what they do is they take the position that if you're a visitor and you haven't made an application for an investment visa and you're clearly carrying on a business, then you're breaching your conditions of stay and you're vulnerable to prosecution. But if you empower the Immigration Department to take a view on your activities with a view to giving you a business investment visa, if you can show that you can pass the approvability test, then, as I say, the mechanism of gathering that information so that they can determine whether you should get the visa or not is encouraging you to breach your conditions of stay. So because of that conundrum, and as I've couched it, the catch-22, effectively the hard and fast rule in my experience is if you're engaging in business and you're a visitor and you don't have an active application for an investment visa in the system, you're vulnerable to prosecution for breach of conditions of stay. On the other hand, if you've got an active application in the system which takes between 4 and 6 months to play itself out anyway, then the Immigration Department forbear to prosecute, and therefore it's safe for you to be carrying on your business until such a time as the Immigration Department have ruled on your application. Now, of course, this is just my interpretation of the way that it works. It's certainly not immigration policy. The Immigration Department would no doubt say, well, no, that's not the case. What we want you to do is to make an application for a business investment visa before you arrive. And I'd say perhaps 10% of the work that we do is involves businesses that are coming in from overseas and haven't yet actually arrived and aren't creating these new facts on the ground. But in my experience, if you take that route, then the amount of investment that you're expected to bring usually is considerably higher. Because by having been on the ground here and created these new facts and showing to the Immigration Department you're gaining traction and that you've employed somebody local and you've got a properly set up office and you've got some work in progress and you've got money coming in as well as going out, all of that will satisfy the Immigration Department as to the essential outcome that you would have an enterprise that will become solidly entrenched here. Whereas if you're just doing it prospectively on the basis of a plan, normally you need to have a lot more money, in my experience, because things tend to cost a lot more and it takes you longer, and you don't actually have the traction that you've got in the business if you've applied from overseas. So the risk to the Immigration Department is higher that you're not going to be able to make a substantial contribution, because if you've created those facts, they can see with their own eyes that you've been able to accomplish that. So that's the catch-22, and that deals with the conundrum of being here as a visitor and having started a business. And if you are sponsored by a third-party employer for an employment visa, but you've stopped working for them, but you still have a valid period of stay manifested in your passport, and you've decided to start your own business, then you effectively have the same catch-22 dimensions in play in your situation. And just a quick note on the whole idea of you having an employment visa sponsored by a third-party employer, but you've stopped working for them. What's your immigration situation in that respect? Well, this is how it works. When you get an employment visa sponsored by a third-party employer, you get two privileges. You get the privilege to work for that employer on those terms and conditions that gave rise to the grant of your visa in the first place, and you get the privilege to reside. And clearly the privilege to reside flows naturally from the privilege to work, because in order for you to report to work each day, you need to be able to live here. When you stop working for your existing employer, your sponsor of record, your privilege to work ceases, but your privilege to reside continues until your current limit of stay expires, whereupon you're expected to leave Hong Kong. However, if in the situation where your privilege to reside continues, effectively, you are in the same situation as a visitor is as regards you joining in a bit or establishing a business, as at the point where you are clearly engaged in the business, you need to make an application to change your status from sponsored employment through to business investment. And the good news is that if you're here as an existing resident, normally the immigration department afford you a certain preference in the consideration exercise. They kind of take the view that if you're already resident, the risks to Hong Kong are less because you've spent some time here, you know how Hong Kong works, and that somehow it's not going to be as risky to the immigration department if they approve your application than if you are here as a visitor and you make your application as a visitor seeking to adjust your status. And this is reflected in the two different teams in immigration that deal with these applications. If you're a visitor applying for a business investment visa, the application takes place on the 24th floor of Immigration Tower. If you're here as an existing resident, it takes place on the 5th floor of Immigration Tower. So it's two different teams that do the applications. They all apply the approvability test to these cases. But if you're an existing resident, you tend to be benefited or privileged in terms of the consideration processes. So it's easier to be an existing resident to get an investment visa approved than if you are here as a visitor. And so the final piece of advice that I'll give you on this is that if you are here as an existing resident and your visa is about to expire and you started your business 3 months ago and you're not quite sure about making the application for the investment visa, no, well, let's wait another 3 months and I'll slip into visitor status. Well, you're actually doing yourself a considerable disservice if you do that, because as I say, if you go into visitor status, it's all going to happen on the 24th floor. If you apply while you're an existing resident, it'll happen on the 5th floor. So you will lose the advantages that I think exist to getting a business investment visa if you're here as an existing resident at the time that you make your application. Does that make sense? Great stuff. Question, yeah?
Are you saying that you should apply when you're still working for your former employer, or you still have a valid
Now, if you've stopped working for your existing employer, but you've still got a valid period of stay manifested in your passport, your ID card isn't really part of the equation. The ID card just reflects the fact that who you are as a person, so to speak. But the immigration status, whilst it's endorsed in your ID card, that if your residence visa expires, your ID card still continues to exist. Yeah. So your ID card serves two purposes: proof of residence as you move across the boundary, but also it is proof of your identity. But if you stop working for your existing employer, your immigration status has changed, in as much as you can't take up employment to join in a business if you haven't secured the permission of the immigration department, if you've stopped working for your previous employer. So if you're in that situation where you've stopped working for your employer, you've still got a few months left, then whilst you've got a few months left, make your application for the investment visa during that window. Yeah? So moving on to family now. The immigration department will afford as far as they possibly can, immigration status to loved ones who are going to be accompanying you whilst you undertake your business on the strength of a business investment visa. And if you are legally married, in a heterosexual legal marriage, and you have children who are unmarried, under the age of 18, or if they're over 18 or in full-time education, they can get dependent visas. And a dependent visa is a great status because effectively, whilst your husband, your wife, who spends 4 to 6 months slaving over the application to get the investment visa, and then falls over the line and gets the approval and gets permission to establish or join in that business, is limited to that activity. But the partner, who's got the dependent visa, gets carte blanche approvals and doesn't have to worry about any of that stuff. So actually, ironically, if you get a dependent visa, your status is superior to the status that your partner who's got the business investment visa has got. Because the investment visa holder is just tied to his company and nothing else. And the dependent visa holder can go off and do whatever they want. So that's the dependent visa. If you are in a de facto spouse relationship, whether it's heterosexual or same-sex partners, you can't get a dependent visa. Even if you're same-sex partners and you have a civil partnership or a legal marriage from another jurisdiction. Because in Hong Kong, unfortunately at the moment, same-sex unions are not recognised in law. The immigration status is available where there isn't a legal marriage is what's called the prolonged visitor visa. And the prolonged visitor visa is what I couch as the slippers and pipe visa. Because if you get a prolonged visitor visa as a de facto spouse, effectively all that you can do is wait at home for your partner to come back every day and hand him his slippers and his pipe. Or you can go and paint pictures of the harbour. That's about it. You can't join in a business, you can't take up employment, you can't study. It's just a visitor visa. It's the same type of status that you get when you arrive at the airport at the boundary, albeit on a prolonged basis. And the test for approval for a prolonged visitor visa is very much the same tests for approval as for a dependent visa, and that is the sponsor of the application, that is the Hong Kong resident partner, needs to be able to show that he or she can put a roof over the head of the partner and food on the table of the partner, and that the relationship is genuine. And in the context of unmarried partners, proving genuine relationship is all about prior cohabitation in Hong Kong, elsewhere other than Hong Kong. It's showing that your relationship has existed for quite some time, and you can prove that your relationship has existed. It's not something where you've been off to the beach in Thailand and met a lovely lady or a lovely man, and you want to come back and deem them to be your de facto in Hong Kong. So there is a requirement to show that you're in a loving, committed life partner relationship, whether it's same-sex or indeed it's heterosexual. So that's essentially, from 39,000 feet, how family members or loved ones are dealt with on the back of investment visa approvals that come in. Okay, so we've looked at the employment visa and the business investment visa and the visas that exist for families. What happens if you get denied? And a lot of cases do get denied. There's no doubt about that. I've discovered down the years that people have their applications refused for very discrete reasons, and these are that the 3 pillars of approval are weak or not there. The one-man business, for example, not having sufficient cash, not being able to show that, notwithstanding your earnestness, you haven't got the resources to allow the immigration department to be satisfied that this can be a sustainable business. Cases get denied on security grounds. As I mentioned earlier on, the less than welcome investment in the context of an unprovable business model for a business that really looked like a pyramid scheme. Cases get denied because they were never going to get approved, like the Chinese mainland resident that makes an application and hasn't lived outside of China for 1 year immediately prior to submitting his application. And cases get denied because, frankly, they just haven't got a very good record with the immigration department. See, it's not often appreciated that as a foreign national you're just a foreigner, right? You may like the place and you hang around Hong Kong a lot, and you shuttle backwards and forwards between Shenzhen and Hong Kong and spend a year and a half as a visitor, and you feel that you put roots down and you're kind of part of the social fabric. But from an immigration perspective, if you're just a foreigner, you've got no rights here. And so, you know, after a certain amount of time, people make applications for an employment visa and they don't get approved. So that's a disappointment. So they go off and they procure another job offer, and they make another application for an employment visa, and that doesn't get approved. And meanwhile, perhaps 9, 12 months have gone by, and they think, well, I'll start my own business. And so, you know, put together the essence of an application plan, and you file it down at the immigration department, and 4 to 6 months later, that gets denied. And at some stage, you know, the immigration department are going to say, well, hang on a minute, you know, it's not costing you anything to make these applications. And our formal rules are that you need to make these applications before you arrive. And it's been, you know, a privilege that we've afforded you each time you've presented yourself as a visitor to allow you to be in Hong Kong. But, you know, at what point, not being a Hong Kong resident, not being a taxpayer, not contributing anything to Hong Kong in a meaningful sense, at what point do you expect us to carry on listening to your applications for residency when clearly we're saying to you, no, we don't want you here? And so you can make an application for an investment visa and you might get denied on the strength that you've had a really poor record of interactions with the immigration department in the past. So every time you make an application to the department, there's a file being built upon you. And so, because remember, it's part of the Security Bureau, so they know everything that's going on, and they'll ask questions and they'll try and find out what's going on. And every set of representations that you make adds to the mosaic of who you are and your credibility as a visa applicant and as a potential resident as well. So if you've got a poor history of dealing with the immigration department, then you may get denied on the strength of that alone, simply because the immigration department don't want you to be a resident. And I've seen that happen enough times in the past to know that it's a very real risk. So cases get denied because they haven't been prepared properly, they haven't attended a talk like this, or use resources like ours, they haven't understood what's actually required for approval. And it's easy to fall into that trap because you can go down to the immigration department, you go to the second floor, the information section there, and the officers are all nicely dressed and they're smiling, and their customer service mandate is in full force. And you've got some questions, sure, this is the answer to the question. Information, yeah, this is the information you need. And you go away from that encounter and you think, wow, this is great. And you see all these other foreigners around Hong Kong and say, wow, they've all got visas, so it can't be that hard. And then they hear from some friends that they've gone through a process and that wasn't that difficult, and it's just a question of filling the forms in, and it's all not a big deal at all. But actually, as you've seen in terms of the business investment visa, there is a discrete set of approvability criteria that the immigration department expect to have present. And if you're not aware of what they are, then you can all too easily fall into the trap of telling the immigration department, effectively, things that are not going to serve your interests in terms of a possible approval. So it makes perfect sense to be well prepared to make an application. Cases get denied because the immigration department have asked for documents and you haven't been able to deliver them. Cases get denied because the immigration department make their determinations on these applications on the strength of the paperwork that you put forward. So if they ask for something, give it to them. In fact, go the extra mile the whole time. And when our applications go into the department, usually the bundles are about this thick. We see applications that are being lodged at the same time as ours, and they're only this thick, but they've got a big smiling self-applicant behind it who hasn't really understood that it's not just a question of shuffling a few papers. You need to have a story. You need to carry the story. You need to tell your story and carry the argument for approval. And that requires a good set of documents to illustrate every single point that you want to make to give yourself a good shot at approval. But that's why cases get denied. And if you do get denied, what's your next move? Well, your next move is to make an appeal, and the language of the appeal is called a reconsideration. And a reconsideration, like all appeals, is an uphill struggle. If you've been denied once, effectively, the only way that you can really get the immigration department to move is if you can submit new and previously unsubmitted information, which has come to light since the time that the immigration department advised you of your refusal. And it needs to be containing significant new additional information which adds weight to the original application, or relevant and new important facts which have come to light of late, and then extra documentation to support the contention that the immigration department got it wrong because they didn't have everything that they needed to truly understand what was going on. If you go back with a whole set of, emotions saying, well, I've got my kids in school, or they're about to start school, or I've already got a 2-year lease on my apartment, none of that the immigration department are concerned about. It doesn't add anything at all to a reconsideration application. And just shuffling the first set of papers and restating what you said originally doesn't add any value either. So, as I say, it's an uphill struggle, and you've got to have something really profound going on to expect a reconsideration will be successful. And of the reconsiderations that come across my desk, I probably take on 5% of them. And what that tells me is that in the main, the immigration department get it right the first time around, and that the applicant shouldn't have put the visa application in the first place. Perhaps they should have waited. But anyway, if the case has merit, the immigration department will come back to you between sort of month 3 and 4 months later, something like that. If it doesn't have merit, you get to know very, very quickly. The department will shut the application down quite quickly. They won't deploy any more resources on it. So what that means is when you go back with the reconsideration, you've got to have your ducks lined up and you've got to have a real story in play. So that's how you go about trying again. But now let's talk about doing it yourself. So, as I mentioned at the outset, the anchor to this talk is 10 must-have resources for any Hong Kong investment visa application. And of these 10 resources, 5 are resources that you absolutely have to use. And the other 5 are resources that I suggest that you refer to and absorb and learn by way of example, and use these resources to assist you in your application. But looking through the 5 must-use resources, the first is this one. It's the one-man investment visa for Hong Kong, what's required. Now, couched as a one-man investment visa. You can't get approved if you're a one-man investment visa, but 99% of all investment visas start out being one person. And this infographic basically just sets out from 39,000 feet all the moving parts to an investment visa application that you're going to have to address your mind to. The second resource is the visa information document. And this document basically puts more flesh on the skeleton that was availed through the initial infographic. And embedded in this resource are links to aspects of the Hong Kong Visa Handbook, which is the definitive guide that we wrote to the Hong Kong visa process, that talks in context or gives you access to resources in context about how to fill in the forms, for example, podcast examples of cases that would add value to your thinking about certain aspects of the application. So there are embedded links in this document that take you through to the next level of detail. One sort of step below the flesh on the skeleton, as it were. And then, once you've understood what the actual challenge of getting an investment visa is really all about, you need to start to prepare a plan for this. And so there's the Hong Kong visa application roadmap, which is available to you. Now, this document was actually developed on the back of a document that we use in our practice to brief amongst ourselves cases to my colleagues. Clearly, I don't do all the immigration cases myself. I think we're 14 people now in the practice. But I take all the instructions, I help devise the strategy, and we agree the strategy with the client. And then on the basis of those discussions and the client engaging us, I then turn around and I brief my colleagues who do all the heavy lifting. And in order to brief my colleagues, we have to follow a structured format. so that every aspect of the application can be laid out so that their state of knowledge is exactly the same as mine, even though they haven't actually been involved in the initial client engagement meetings. So that's a document that we use internally. So we adjusted it slightly to reflect this that you can use, which is the application roadmap. And at the end of the exercise, if you fill in this application roadmap, you'll end up with a fully actionable application plan. And when you get this resource down free from the web, you receive an email every day for 4 days, because there are 4 sections to the application, and each of those 4 sections are accompanied by a short video presentation. It's about 10 minutes each, that teaches you everything that you need to know to complete the various sections of the application roadmap, resulting in, once it's fully completed after 4 or 5 days, a fully actionable plan for your application. So that's the third resource. The fourth resource is 3 particular sets of case examples that wouldn't get approved. And by understanding how these prior cases played out, you have an appreciation of what might work by way of example in your situation. And then finally, all the templates that you need to give effect to an application are detailed here in this section of the Hong Kong Visa Handbook. And this is the key one. It's called the Business Investment Visa Cover Letter. If you download it, you'll see it's actually a template with all the sections that you'll have to write up your argument in and tell your story in, all detailed by way of headings. So you take your application plan from the roadmap and sit down, and then you write your argument against that template. And then you end up with a complete bundle of information, because you write your argument and then you also set your addendum, and your addendum contains or reflects all the documents that you're submitting in support of the application. So those are the first key 5, and then these are the other 5. In fact, there are 6 on this page, including the short PowerPoint presentation from me. One's a video about the business plan. If you have a business plan, that's great. If you want to write a business plan but haven't written one yet, then there's a template there that you can use. Immigration Department, by the way, no more want to read a 60-page business plan than you want to write one. So if you think you need to write a business plan for the purposes of your application, I wouldn't worry about it. If you use these resources, the template cover letter and the application plan, the roadmap, will basically guide you through the process of telling the Immigration Department what they need to hear without needing to encapsulate it in a 60-page plan. Although, of course, having a business plan is always a good idea, just in terms of clarifying your own thinking. Short video on the topic that I mentioned earlier about the advantages if you're an existing resident, and then just some other resources that you'll find useful throughout the current of your application. And then finally, once you've gotten to a point where you think you're ready to submit your application, any questions you have, you're welcome to ask me them via the blog, and within 48 hours, I'll give you a podcast answer, completely free of charge. So that's it. Thanks for your engagement. Have you got any questions you'd like to ask me?
So I have a question about a slightly different situation. So put in a situation where the company being founded in Hong Kong is actually a wholly owned subsidiary of a company in another country.
Yeah.
Is that viewed upon more favorably by the Immigration Department? And then is the business investment visa still the appropriate one to cover the director?
It all depends. It all depends on the caliber of the overseas entity. Mm-hmm. If it's a mere holding entity that was established just for the purposes of this visa, the Immigration Department, they'll call for all the evidence about the holding company.
That the holding company is actually in operation.
Yep. So
okay.
Audited financial statements, bank statements for the last 3 months. They want to make sure that there's a good, solid parent entity supporting this local entity. Okay. And then, if in this instance you can prove that the person that's applying for the visa to be sponsored by the wholly owned sub was an executive of the credible parent company, and even if he's the majority shareholder in the business, you can make an application for an employment visa for him on an intercompany transferee basis. And so that would be a It wouldn't be an investment visa per se, it would be the employment visa based on a job offer because it's an intercompany transferee. But it's a new company situation. So where there's a new company situation, the Immigration Department always look to see that the three legs of the approvability stool are present. So they do the determination on the strength of special skills, knowledge and experience of value to not really available in Hong Kong, but the entity here, the sub, will still have to prove that it's a suitable and credible sponsor, which means that all the kind of requirements that are assessed on the investment visa are assessed here as well. It just takes, instead of taking 4 to 6 months, it take about 2 months instead.
Okay, so basically, the immigration department is going to go through all the same series of checks and asking the same questions. Just I would submit a different type of paper.
Correct.
So I think it's like 990B.
Exactly.
999.
It's 99B instead of 9990.
Okay.
Got a question?
What to do with the Hong Kong ID when you leave Hong Kong for good? Can you give it unique info? What to do when you decide to leave Hong Kong? Do you need to inform immigration that you are leaving? You need to leave your ID? Or?
Well, technically, you're supposed to notify the Immigration Department of any material change in circumstances within 30 days of that happening. That's technically. I've been doing this for 21 years. I've never met a single instance of an individual that has left and says, you know what I do? I'm packing up my apartment and doing all the other things. So I really must write to the Immigration Department and let them know that I'm leaving. You're supposed to, but nobody seems to do that. And for your ID card, well, your identity card, as I mentioned earlier, serves two purposes. On the microchip, the Immigration Department embed your current immigration status and your current limit of stay, which allows you to exit through the smart channels at the airport, but it also serves as proof of identity. So if you cease being a resident, there's no requirement to return your identity card, and most people don't, and it will still form the purposes that it was designed for in terms of proof of identity. But if you leave Hong Kong with your ID card and then come back for a holiday 3 years later and you try and enter using your ID card, it won't let you do it because your immigration status doesn't allow you, isn't reflected in your chip.
But there are no any penalties if you go.
No.
How does the immigration service appreciate the business plan? Do they rely on external consultants or they know all about all businesses?
No, it's a great question. Dealing with immigration is always interesting, right? Because we get this wide array of clients, and we see gazillions of business plans, and we see all that stuff, right? And then we synthesize what's going on, and then we make recommendations and suggestions as to what might represent the best way of arguing your case to the immigration department. You put it into the immigration department, you argue it that way, right? Now, I've been doing it for 21 years, and I've seen every permutation of every business plan that's ever existed in the history of the universe. There's nothing that surprises me anymore. But it begs the question, what do the immigration officers, who are ultimately government bureaucrats, they're not entrepreneurs, they've never had to make payroll, at the end of the month on credit card advances. They don't know what that stuff feels like. They've never had money at risk in what they do. But what's the psychology of the examining officers to the business stories that come in? All I can say is that given the breadth of experience that we have, their breadth of experience must be significantly wider, right? Because we don't do all the investment visas that get approved in this town. The conversations that we have with immigration officers suggest that they're very clued in. They are in the main, I'd say, sensitive to the challenges faced by entrepreneurs. But sometimes they can get it wrong. And when they get it wrong, it's indicative of them not thinking properly about the business or understanding it properly. And that's okay because they're not living, eating and breathing this stuff, right? So they don't know it to the level that the entrepreneur applicant does. I'll give you an example. We had an application that was a great application. There was suitable business premises, several local jobs, great IP, money coming in. It was all going really, really good. But the immigration department balked on granting an approval initially because they looked at a document that says, well, okay, under this IP arrangement, you're going to have to make a payment of, say, $500,000 Hong Kong dollars 4 months from now when the 1 year anniversary comes up. And we're looking at the amount of cash that you've got in your bank account, okay? And we're not persuaded that you're solvent because you're going to have to make this payment, but we don't see the money here. But what they didn't appreciate is that they had so much stock that was out there. It was representative of all the accounts receivables. It represented several $1 million. They could only look at what they appeared to be readily available funds to meet this obligation, and they said, no, we have a problem with this. Now, we fixed it in the end, but we had to do a lot of work to educate the immigration department as to that reality, and that's an example of the immigration department not being commercial.
Is there anything to be careful about when filling in employment visa application? Anything tricky or to be particularly specifically?
No, just make sure that you can pass the approvability test. The person's is a professional, nobody local can do the job. Make sure that he's getting compensation that's broadly commensurate with market rates. Minimum $16,500 a month in salary. That's just the minimum. Yeah, my experience. Some cases get approved a little bit marginally lower than that, but you don't want to be bottom feeding, right? You want to be going with a robust application.
Do job just half of the amount? Could that be lower
No.
then, or that's
No,
not good
it's
start?
you can't get an employment visa with part-time employment. It must be full-time.